Aswan rock art mystery. Before the pyramids rose against the desert sky, before even the word Pharaoh was spoken, Egypt was a patchwork of rival chiefs and scattered river villages. But somewhere along the banks of the Nile, something happened that would change the world forever. And just recently, archaeologists working near Aswan stumbled across a carved rock panel that may rewrite the first chapter of that story. Etched into the stone are the outlines of a boat, long, elegant, unmistakably Egyptian in style, alongside a human figure wearing what might be an early crown. But here's the twist: there's no royal crest, no formal hieroglyphs, nothing tying it directly to any king we know. Some experts believe it could date to a time before the first recognized pharaoh, a shadow ruler from a forgotten page of history. If that's true, then Egypt's rise wasn't a lightning strike under a single man, but a slow, smoldering fuse, one lit long before Narmer's famous victory. And that fuse was about to ignite. Egypt before kings. Long before Egypt was one kingdom, it was two lands: Upper Egypt in the south, where the Nile cuts through narrow valleys, and Lower Egypt in the north, a maze of green marshlands and tangled waterways in the delta. Each region had its own customs, gods, and rulers. Power shifted constantly between small city-states, their leaders competing for control over fertile land, trade routes, and the loyalty of neighboring villages. Archaeologists call this the Nakata III period, a time when art, weapons, and burial styles were already hinting at something bigger. In Upper Egypt, graves grew larger and richer, holding imported goods from as far away as the Levant. Symbols began to appear on pottery and ivory tags, the earliest flickers of Egyptian writing. Some of these marks seem to record the names of estates or towns, an early sign that local rulers were thinking beyond their village borders. But unity was still far off. The Nile was both a lifeline and a dividing line, and warbands moved up and down its waters as often as trade ships. And yet, somewhere in this constant push and pull, alliances began to form. Alliances that would eventually make warlords into kings. Narmer and the unification of the two lands. Around 3100 BC, a single name rises out of the dust: Narmer. Some call him the first pharaoh, others think he may be the legendary Menes, spoken of in later texts. Whatever the truth, his legacy begins with one of the most famous artifacts in ancient history, the Narmer Palette. On one side, Narmer towers over a kneeling enemy, gripping him by the hair, his arm raised to deliver the final blow. He wears the tall white crown of Upper Egypt, and beside him, the falcon god Horus subdues a papyrus plant, symbol of the delta. It's a visual message: Upper Egypt is conquering the north. Flip the palette, and Narmer now wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. Behind him march standard-bearers, and in front, a grisly row of decapitated foes. It's the earliest image of a ruler wearing both crowns, the two lands united under one hand. Whether Narmer won through relentless war, strategic marriage, or both, the result was the same. Egypt now had a single ruler, a centralized authority, and a capital city poised to control it all. But unification was only the first step. What Narmer built would need to be organized, glorified, and made eternal. Building a kingdom: power, craft, and stone. With the two lands united, Narmer and his successors faced a new challenge: turning a victory into a functioning state. The answer was organization on a scale the Nile had never seen. The capital shifted north to Memphis, a strategic hub between Upper and Lower Egypt. From here, officials began dividing the country into provinces, collecting taxes in grain, livestock, and linen. Writing, once just a set of symbols on pottery, became a tool of government, etched into ivory tags, clay seals, and perhaps even papyrus scrolls that have long since disappeared. In the royal tombs of Abydos, archaeologists have found something astonishing: tens of thousands of stone vessels, carved from alabaster, diorite, and even hard granite. Some are so precisely made that modern craftspeople still puzzle over how they were shaped. These weren't just storage jars, they were political statements. Every vessel whispered the same message: only the king could command such skill, such resources, and such beauty. The court wasn't just building objects, it was building an image, an idea of kingship as something eternal. And that idea would be carried, quite literally, on the waters of the Nile. The ghost fleet of Abydos. At the desert edge near Abydos, archaeologists uncovered something eerie, long, narrow graves shaped like boats. Inside, some lay the remains of full-sized wooden vessels, complete with planks, ribs, and even anchors. These weren't warships or cargo haulers. They were funerary boats, buried to carry a king's spirit into the afterlife. To the ancient Egyptians, the Nile wasn't just a river. It was a cosmic highway. In death, the king would journey on the solar bark with the gods, sailing through the night sky to be reborn with the dawn. These real boats were the earthly counterpart to that divine voyage. It wasn't enough for a ruler to be buried with treasures. He had to be equipped for eternity, armed not only with symbols of power, but with the means to travel between worlds. The boat graves at Abydos tell us that the early pharaohs weren't just thinking about ruling Egypt, they were thinking about ruling forever. But this was no closed kingdom. Even as Egypt's kings secured their borders, they were reaching far beyond them, trading, raiding, and, as new evidence suggests, sharing something even more fundamental: a genetic twist in the pharaoh's blood. For centuries, we've imagined the first pharaohs as purely Egyptian in origin, born of the Nile, shaped by its floods, isolated from the outside world. But science is starting to complicate that picture. In early 2025, researchers sequenced the full genome of an individual from Egypt's old kingdom, buried at a site tied to the country's earliest rulers. The results were surprising. Roughly 20% of this person's ancestry traced back to the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of agriculture in Mesopotamia and the Levant. This doesn't mean Egypt was foreign-made. Instead, it hints at a deeper truth: that ideas, technologies, and even people were moving along ancient trade routes long before the pyramids. Farmers from the east may have brought new crops or irrigation techniques. Traders could have carried exotic goods and distant genes into the Nile Valley. It's a reminder that the rise of Egypt wasn't sealed off behind desert walls. The first pharaohs stood at the crossroads of Africa and the Near East, and their bloodlines may hold the story of how those worlds met. And as we pull these threads together, rock art, war palettes, ghost fleets, and royal blood, the picture of Egypt's birth becomes stranger and more fascinating than the legends ever told. What we know and what we don't. Put it all together, and the birth of ancient Egypt looks less like a single dramatic moment, and more like a long, tangled story. Villages along the Nile grew into chiefdoms. Trade and warfare pulled distant regions into contact. Symbols carved on ivory and stone hinted at unity before it was official. Narmer's unification was a turning point, yes, but new finds, like the Aswan rock art, suggest the path to that moment stretched back farther than we thought. Elaborate boat burials show that kingship was always about more than politics, it was about eternity. And the genetic evidence reveals Egypt as a crossroads, not an island, from its very first days. But questions remain. Was unification a swift conquest or a gradual weaving together of alliances? Were early rulers the sole architects of Egypt's rise, or were they standing on foundations built by forgotten leaders whose names have vanished from history? What's clear is that Egypt's story still has missing pages, and each discovery pulls us closer to reading them. Conclusion: the hidden dawn of Egypt. From scattered river settlements to a kingdom stretching hundreds of miles, the Early Dynastic Period was Egypt's great experiment, and it worked. In just a few generations, its rulers forged a system of governance, religion, and imagery so powerful that it would endure for over 3,000 years. But the closer we look, the more we see that Egypt's beginning wasn't a clean sunrise. It was a slow ignition, a blend of local innovation, foreign influence, symbolic power, and sheer ambition. Rock art near Aswan hints at rulers who predate our first official king. The Narmer Palette freezes a moment of victory that may have been decades in the making. Abydos boats carry the dream of eternal rule. And a sliver of DNA tells us that even at the dawn of history, Egypt's story was already woven with threads from faraway lands. The truth is, the more we uncover, the less final the story feels. Somewhere under the sand, another carving, another tomb, another boat could still change everything we think we know. Because the birth of Egypt isn't just history, It's a living mystery. And its next chapter is still waiting to be found.